Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Hope you're doing well. And for anyone that's just joining us here, but was expecting me to be on earlier, I apologize. I did have to make some changes today based on some other things that were going on. But appreciate your flexibility with me. And for anyone that's joining the live stream, or I'm sorry, the replay of the live stream, thank you so much for watching it after the fact, and I hope it's helpful to you. So today, we'll give everyone a few minutes to join in, but we're going to do a couple different things here as part of the intro. Number one, I'm just going to mention up front that my voice is very weak for whatever reason today. I woke up this morning thinking I wasn't going to be able to do any live streams. I've got plenty of work behind the scenes to do, interviews I've already done, I have to edit. But I woke up thinking, man, oh man, my voice is too raspy. We'll see. So here we are at 2:00 in the afternoon Eastern time. We'll see if I can hold it together. If at some point I just start coughing, I'll apologize again in advance, and we'll wrap it up there. I've got another one scheduled for tonight for 6:00. I'm gonna give it a 75% chance of not happening, again because of my voice. But I do have some goals of doing some live streams again tomorrow, so hopefully that'll work out, and we'll gargle salt water all night and lots of hot tea. So, wanted to mention before we get into today's topic, I'm going to do this a little bit differently, and what I wanted to say about that is this. A lot of times when you look at a topic, any topic, it's real easy to look at it, especially from a YouTuber's perspective, of like, what can I just quickly get out there? Your speed is the thing. You produce. What's the next topic? What can I say about it? You're brainstorming all over. You're using your resources. You're doing everything you can to just get something out there. And sometimes that's good enough. It works just fine. But like a lot of topics, sometimes you have to say to yourself, there's a lot of layers to this, and there's a lot of background information. And with almost any topic that's ever come across my radar, I mean, even when I was a Christian and now, almost anything that anybody says to me about almost anything, my immediate thought, if they have any sense of like, this is the conclusion, like I know this is how to see it, this is the right way to see it, my immediate conclusion is there's probably a lot more to say about that. It doesn't mean that my conclusion will shift with that new information, but it's nice to know the context, right? And so we're going to talk about a topic that's probably near and dear to a lot of our hearts, at least in the past, which is the topic of spiritual warfare and being a Christian soldier. And I picked the title "Onward Christian Soldiers" because we all know that that's one of the songs that we used as our rallying cry. Real quick, just a few comments. Hey, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you here. Susanna from Scotland, thank you so much for being a part of this. And Starseed Chance, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your being a part of this community a lot. You show up for so many things, so thank you so much. And when I look at the topic of being a Christian soldier, and I look at the topic of spiritual warfare as I've experienced the topic over the years, as well as just as I've seen other Christian groups do it, there's a lot there that I already know, and I could just kind of spout off what I know from my experience. But I think there's some deeper contextual things that, number one, just explain it more, explain what's going on in our heads when we're stuck in it. And also, of course, what's going on in their heads, the people that we still love that are still stuck in it. But also it helps us to just see a broader picture of what's really going on behind the scenes. And I'd like to ask, if you could, to just bear with me. This is going to be slightly less intense, less poetic, less like, oh, we've got so much to, just want to make a big bang and make you feel it. You're not going to feel it today. This is more just slowly meandering through the topic. So if you're looking for more the poetic hit, so to speak, I'm not doing that today. We might wrap this one up in a few days with a poem or something like that. But today is just going to be more like just talking through a topic. But I think it's worth it. And I think you'll see why, especially if you watch all of these. I think you're going to see that it helps to get a bigger, broader picture. So I want to start by talking about something that doesn't seem related necessarily right away to spiritual warfare. And it is basically humanity. Our human journey, a lot of our spiritual heritage that we've come out of is more related to anthropomorphism than to the Bible and Christianity or Judaism. And I hope that's stating the obvious, but if you haven't thought about that, I think it's worth thinking about. So we're going to start there. there is within our human history a long history basically of having enemies, whether they're real or invented. When you strip back every theology to its bones, there is something universal in a sense. It is a human brain trying to make sense of perceived danger. Long before there were any Bibles or even languages that were written down, long before there were necessarily priesthoods and temples, the world terrified us as a species. There were storms, there was sickness, there was famine, there was death, and all those things were reminders that we were very small and fragile in a world in which we have very little control. And the human mind does what it tends to do. It looked for patterns and it connected cause and effect. It asked, when we were still more primates than we are now, more like the swinging from the trees primates than the humans that walked upright. When we started that journey, we were already doing cause and effect. We were asking why, and when we couldn't find an answer, it seems like we were pretty good at inventing one, whether it has any relationship to reality or not. That is the context and the crucible in which the idea of gods and devils are born. That's the gap, as it were, between terror and understanding. And it's like between like lightning in the sky and what does it mean? When you look at this, again, from an anthropomorphic or anthropological perspective, you're looking at what they call agency detection bias. It's our brain's tendency to assume that if anything is happening, if anything is moving, especially if there's a misfortune, there must be some reason behind it, some kind of agent. We evolved, our imagination evolved, where we would hear things and we would think that could be the grass rustling, but that could be an animal that wants to be a predator. And we could be about to be somebody's lunch. And that survival impulse, that reflex, gave us this whole universe in our mind of invisible intentions. Is there a spirit there? Why is it raining right now? Why is it not raining then? Why is it so hot? Why is it so cold? Why is there a flood? We think to ourselves in that era of our human history that there are spirits involved. There's certainly animals, but there might be spirits, ancestors, eventually gods and demons. I saw this a lot. Oh, thank you, Susanna, for being here. Appreciate that. Welcome back to the party. I saw this a lot when I was in New Guinea. And when I was with a group called New Tribes Mission, and they're now called Ethnos 360. And they do a really good job. I mean, it's getting Christianized, but they do a really good job of letting you know that when you go to a tribe in the middle of the jungle, you're going into a very different worldview than you're used to. And for most of those tribes, it's going to be what we call animism. It's the idea that there are spirits in everything. And your goal in animism is not to go worship something. Your goal is to figure out which spirits are going to, number one, just acknowledge you. Some spirits have nothing to do with you, and they're never gonna. They're gonna be there, and you can kind of figure out that they're there, but they're not interested in you. And that's probably, a good thing from their perspective. Just doesn't matter. They're irrelevant. But there's a bunch of spirits that are in other categories where they're either going to help you or hurt you, or they're going to flip-flop where they could like you, but if you don't do the right thing, they're going to get you, right? Or they're going to like you at first, but then you don't do something right, they're going to turn around and be on your enemy side. And the big question, of course, in everyone's mind is once you figure out what spirits are out there and what they're going to do to you, how do you manipulate them? So, for example, they told us, you might see somebody, one of the tribal people, you might see them having a big garden, and they might have a big sickle where they could cut down all their corn or whatever real quick. But they'll instead do it with a little paring knife, a little teeny knife. And you might ask them, well, why are you doing that? And they would eventually, if you ask the right questions, you'd figure out that what they're doing is they're saying there is a spirit in this field, and the spirit, if we do it real slow, they won't even notice us. But if we do it real quick with a sickle, they'll be upset at us. Or they would say, if a baby wakes up in the middle of the night, the spirits in the jungle will come and try to take its spirit. So everyone wakes up when the baby cries. The whole tribe wakes up and starts sweeping all the dirt of the tribal floor, just sweep, because there's so much chaos, and then the spirits can't tell where the baby is. All kinds of little rules, and you're not, again, worshiping any of them. You're just negotiating. And so in that context, again, we learn to make these offerings. We learn to do certain actions, certain taboos. We sing songs. We're begging for mercy. We're begging for something good, or at least for the bad things to leave us alone. That was, in a sense, the first form of religion and politics. We are doing this diplomacy with the unseen world. In that same context, there was this second. Hey, great to see you, Oren. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, for anyone that wasn't here at the beginning, I apologize. I am struggling with my voice today, so I'm going to do as much as I can. It might be an hour or two. It might be 45 minutes. It might be 30 minutes. We're just going to go as long as we can and stop there. But anyway, we're talking about the sort of the origins of spiritual warfare, and we're going to eventually get to current day, but we're talking very broadly, very contextually first. So in the midst of this animism kind of stuff that was going on, in our attempts, very vague and early attempts to understand the world, there was also the issue of tribalism. Our ancestors were learning quickly that survival didn't just mean appeasing the spirits, but on trusting each other, trusting the group, figuring out which tribes were your friends, which weren't, which ones seemed to be your friends, but which ones were going to stab you in the back. And, if you belong to a strong, loyal tribe, you're going to probably live longer. And if you wavered or betrayed someone, or someone betrayed you, you get left behind, you're dead, you don't have food, whatever. Your brain builds these instincts. The in-group, where you're loyal, and the out-group, of which you're very suspicious. And so you learn to sort the world from a very early anthropologic era. We learn to sort the world into it's us versus them. And so safety comes from we're the same. Danger comes from that's different. So every tribe, and if they want to stay united, needs a story to explain why we are in this tribe, why we're chosen, and why others are not. And that story is basically the seed of every holy war. But I'm jumping ahead there and saying that, but you know how I'm connecting the dots already. But you get in this sort of the birth of moral dualism. Once human beings could imagine that behind every good thing or bad thing, fortune or misfortune, morality or immorality, that there's some kind of agency. And therefore, your stance and your connection, your group, your morality becomes a form of warfare by metaphor. Disease or some kind of death or anything bad, it's not just natural. It's punishment. Someone may have done some kind of curse on you or something. Your enemies aren't just rivals. They become slowly embodiments of this warfare that's going on, almost like a cosmic disorder. And so our species didn't just fight, arguably, we moralized the fight. And therefore we're entering this stage of this moral dualism. We tend to divide reality into absolute good and absolute evil instead of gray area and gradients of complexity. Dualism is intoxicating because it simplifies the chaos. You're turning tragedy into purpose. You have all this anxiety about what do I do and what's going to happen next. You're turning it into your part of your identity. And it offers one of the most powerful psychological rewards that we want, which is certainty. I want to know that everything's going to be okay. That's my reward. And when you can label yourself as good and everyone else as bad, you don't have to confront the ambiguity very much. You don't have to confront the ambiguity much because that ambiguity is kind of terrifying. You feel like you're on the good side and your righteousness, in a sense, becomes your safety zone. I'm just going to check the comments here. Let's see here. Taylor Studios, great to see you. I got into a debate with a Christian a while ago, and they said the bones of Adam and Eve were found. What's hilarious is that they never gave a citation for that. Yeah, absolutely. There's no way to know. I can't wait to dig into the topic of being chosen. Yeah, absolutely. That's a big one. Adam and Eve are novel characters. The messaging is they're plantation serfs or slaves who worked in the monarch's presence. Yeah. A lot of that stuff is crazy. The origins of it, and a lot of different origins possible for it. You need to read the Bible even to be a Christian. Nobody here really wants to be a Christian. We don't care if we read the Bible or not. Satan tried to flee them from the bondage and return to them their sexual organs, allow them to be literate, educated. Again, Satan was invented a long time after that. That wasn't Satan. That was a serpent, which is a reflection of their motifs of just basic knowledge. But it's all mythology. Anyway, I want to keep moving. So again, we're talking at this point about the in-group, the out-group, and if you add into it this idea of what's come to be called terror management theory, where your awareness of bad things in life, certainly things like disease, but also death, whatever, dismemberment, all these things that could go bad in your life, you're it's going to start to shape your human behavior, because when you're reminded of your mortality, when you're reminded of the bad things that are possible and most likely coming for you, you cling harder to the belief systems that give your life meaning. So everything from early religion to our current kinds of religions to nationalism and even versions of consumerism, they sort of become forms of this symbolic immortality, where this holy war in this framework becomes this defense mechanism against our incredible anxiety against the bad things of life and against death. If you see the world as a battlefield, then your suffering and ultimately your death becomes part of a bigger story. And you're not just a fragile creature in this vast, uncaring universe that's going to eventually wipe you out, whether you like it or not, possibly painfully. Instead, you're a warrior in a cosmic narrative that ultimately cannot fail. And that certainty and that bigger transcendent reality becomes very addicting. You might die, but the cause will not die. Your meaning is going to outlive your body. It's going to outlive your pain. And so across many cultures, war becomes a kind of immortality machine. It sort of turns your existential dread of like, oh my gosh, am I going to live much longer? Am I going to live healthily? What's going to happen? All that dread, it turns into a purpose. There's a reason you're here. And whether you're going through suffering or not, it's all for a good, bigger purpose. So it makes killing and dying somewhat sacred, at least in certain contexts when you explain it and when you're on the right side. So again, we're going to we're adding layers to this. I feel like we're kind of, sort of putting leaves upon leaves upon leaves, or papers upon papers, building it up very slowly. But I hope that this is helpful. And by the way, I see some different comments on here. A lot of my are not very related at all to what I'm talking about. So honestly, I'm just going to keep going. So I apologize. That's not to say I don't appreciate some of your questions, but I'm going to stay focused. So this is I'm turning this sort of into a class, as it were, and I hope that's okay with you. But again, long before the Bible, long before Judaism and Christianity, we as humans were describing our existence as a divine combat. This is when the gods went to war. When you look at things like Mesopotamia, you have Marduk, who is slaying the dragon of the sea, Tiamat, to bring order from chaos. In Egypt, you've got Horus battling Set for this cosmic stability. In Canaan, Baal defeats Yam, the god of the sea, to bring fertility to the land. Myths upon myths upon myths get encoded, and they're bringing something profound. The creation itself is an act of violence, and to bring order to it, to conquer the chaos, is part of how you win. And as the god, you suppress the enemy, you maintain balance, you take control. And so when the ancient Hebrews began composing their ideas in that same region, they weren't inventing anything from scratch. They were absorbing and reframing the worldviews around them. They were taking the language of combat and applying it to their moral life. And so their God, Yahweh, would not merely create the world. He would defeat it into existence. And a little different, though, from Marduk and Baal, Yahweh wouldn't just rule over one nation like Israel. He would demand exclusive allegiance. There were no rivals that were tolerated. And so from the beginning, his identity was built on conflict. And in that context, again, you need to have a chosen people. And when sociologists look at some of this stuff, they note that groups under threat tend to become more cohesive, more authoritarian, more ideologically rigid, because the fear is tightening the boundaries and it's enforcing conformity. And it's saying, we're going to sanctify violence as part of our defense. Ancient Israel was certainly, arguably from the stories we know, in need of that. They were surrounded by larger, better armed powers such as Egypt, Syria, Babylon, etc. And its very survival depended on their internal loyalty and their religious distinctiveness. And so the priestly authors of these books told stories that transformed their fragility into sort of a new destiny. You're not weak, you're chosen. You're not few, you're a select, pure, remnant. The gods of the nations are not our rivals, they are abominations. And that, in a sense, if I can use the word genius, it's the psychological genius of chosenness. It turns your existential insecurity into a divine election. To be oppressed at all becomes proof that you're special. To be small becomes proof that you're protected. You are one of the people on the narrow path. It feels like you're not in a big group, but ultimately your group will be sustained, your group will win, and eventually the tide will turn. You will be the victors, and everybody will say, "Holy smokes, where did this come from?" But you will be in the chosen few that will make it. Everyone else will be destroyed. In that equation, everyone outside the group becomes either a potential convert or a legitimate target, more likely. And so the function of the enemies sort of serve some different functions in this group psychology, but number one, the enemy is going to serve to give you cohesion, because you hate them. You have this shared hatred. You have this shared hatred, and it's going to unify you, unfortunately, faster than any kind of shared love. And I don't know about you, but I watch a lot of videos coming out of Gaza from different people that are looking at it from different perspectives. And you have so many people on the side of fighting against the Gazans who are absolutely, completely willing to just give up all morality and they just hate because they hate. And they're willing to do atrocious things to both adults as well as babies. Their cohesion by their hatred, their shared hatred, has unified them. They think they have a moral clarity. When you define evil sort of externally, it allows you to feel like you're self-righteous internally. You say, they're bad, they're wicked. And it wraps up as well as in the obedience, because you have this hierarchy, these leaders that become your protectors. If you obey them, they will lead us forward into righteous actions, and they will keep us safe on the narrow path. And you eventually have a bit of a perpetual relevance, that as long as the enemies exist, the authority should never expire, because the authority will keep us in line, and the battle's always going on. The battle, like, you can't sleep on this. The battle's ongoing. You will be in great danger if you see this as a safe zone. It's not safe. There is a battle all over. Keep your weapons sharp. And so when religion adopts that model, it creates a perpetual, unending machine, the moral war that never stops, because it never can stop. The enemy is essential, and your fight against the enemy is essential. Without the good versus bad, black versus white, in group, out group, the whole system just collapses. And so it's no accident that monotheism, the belief in one God, evolves alongside the belief in there's a great adversary. There's two great ideas that are going to fight. There's a reason. There's a reason that in so many of the battles that you see in these movies, the Avengers and so forth, they keep on finding ways to come back. You can't really end it. Even earlier movies, I remember, Jason Voorhees, like, why can't they just kill him and be done? The reason they can't kill the guy and be done and it just end is because there'd be no more movies, right? You have to have some magical way that he comes back, and the fight has to keep going. And that's why God wouldn't kill Satan, wouldn't kill Lucifer at the beginning. He needs an adversary. The two ideas sustain each other. An absolute God requires an absolute enemy. Without Satan, Yahweh is just another deity in the pantheon. With Satan, he becomes the supreme commander of all reality and all righteousness. And so Christian, and we're going to, just so you know, for context, we're going to go back and forth between some of the old history and some of the newer stuff, but I'm trying to contextualize it with different layers, so bear with me. Christianity obviously emerged a lot later, centuries later, but it began to perfect this pattern because it inherited first the moral vocabulary of good and evil, but also a neurological architecture of fear and belonging that had held Israel together, the ancient Hebrews. It refined that architecture into a totalizing moral system. Other religions allowed for cycles, creation and destruction, yin and yang, light and shadow. But Christianity came along and it sort of froze the pattern into permanence. It turned life into a linear war, one beginning, one end, one decisive victory. And the stakes became infinite. The timeline became eternal. There's no gray area. There's no truce. In most cultures, the gods fight and then reconcile. In Christianity, the fight does not end. It's sort of one of the central organizing metaphors of the universe to Christians. Evil doesn't balance good. Evil must be eradicated. You got to destroy it. And human beings who think they're created in the image of God become enlisted in this project. It's one of the oldest narratives that we know, but it gets sharpened into something very, 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 very militant. The enemy isn't just out there even. The enemy might be within you. So you have to look at yourself, fight against yourself, and fight against the evil everywhere. The idea that the battle runs through every person's human soul is turning religion from a story into a psychology, really. And so before we even open the Bible, before we ever quote verses, this stage was already set, because we are a species that fears death. We seek belonging. We find safety in conflict. We are built to imagine enemies, and we're built to sanctify the fight. And Christianity inherited this full weight of that story. They didn't create the reflex. It was already there. Christianity just codified it. It gave it liturgy. It made it part of our much larger and critical story of life and eternity. It took the oldest human survival strategy and made it part of the divine plan. And that's where this war that we're going to talk about over several live streams, this war of spiritual warfare that we Christians know so well, especially in the Pentecostal groups, that's where this war began. It didn't necessarily begin in anything really that special. It was really, from the earliest days, just our nervous system. It was our nervous system saying that wind over there might be the grass rustling, but it could be an animal that wants to try to attack me. In that psychology, we were frightened, and we could not bear to live without some kind of safety and some kind of meaning. And so we're going to begin to look a little bit more about how that primal instinct took a more, absolutely identifiable form, how this small desert tribe, as it were, desperate for survival, turns this fear that we all have as primates into theology. And it turns basically the God, Yahweh, into like the general of the army. So I'm going to look for any comments here I need to respond to. Aaron asks, do the other 26,000 subscribers usually trickle in? I'm not sure what you mean. It depends on if people are available. It's a Saturday, so some people might be out shopping or doing other things, but they'll come when they come, or they'll watch the replay. That's not really relevant to this discussion. Let's see here. Yeah, natives often use two wolves to describe good and bad. Yeah, for sure. Hey, John, thank you so much for joining us from Holland. Wow. And Susanna says, I love this being explained. It really helps make sense of it all. Thank you so much, Susanna. I appreciate you being, as always, part of our discussions in our group. And I apologize again, everyone, for my voice. I'm going to try to go for at least an hour. And that's what he said. And then I'll see if I can't, go much further than that. We'll just pick it up on the next one. But going back to this verbiage of combat and God becoming a general in the army, one of the words that we find is that God is called Yahweh Sabaoth. Have you ever heard of that? Yahweh Sabaoth. That is a word that means tribal God of armies. And so when we open the Hebrew scriptures, we're not reading just this moral story, these moral poems. We're reading the survival literature of a very small Iron Age nation, again, surrounded by very powerful empires. And their God, Yahweh, was born in that pressure cooker. Canaan was this little narrow strip of land connecting Africa and Mesopotamia and all the other groups in the Middle East and that part of Asia. And they were trampled almost constantly by larger powers. Again, Egypt was coming from the south, and Assyria and Babylon. The Philistine sea peoples from the coast were coming in. The ancient Hebrews really, from what we know, never really had a massive empire, but they lived in the crossfire of a lot of other massive empires. The economy there was agrarian, and so those, you're looking at farms, you're looking at villages that would have little walls, you're looking at a very small army, and so everything, every harvest could be seized, every generation of people could be displaced or made into slaves, or genocide could occur. And in that crucible, identity itself became your defense. If people could not outarm their enemies. They could not beat the people with all the much better weapons and the much bigger armies, but they could outbelieve them. And that's where this is a fascinating part of the history of it. When you look at some of the earliest inscriptions in Hebrew, such as like in the 8th century BCE, they mention things like the Yahweh of Samaria and the Yahweh of Teman. These were local manifestations of this regional storm god who was worshipped along with Asherah, the consort. And Yahweh sort of resembled the Canaanite Baal. He was a rider of the clouds. He was the giver of rain. He could wield lightning. He was like Thor. But during all these centuries of invasion and exile and slavery and genocide, Israel's theologians, they sort of did this interesting and somewhat radical act of consolidating things consolidating the stories, they took all the rivals away from Yahweh, and they said, he's not just a God of war. He is the cosmic sovereign. At first they said there are other gods, but they're smaller. Yahweh is the main God who commands all the armies, heavenly and human. And you see the words Yahweh Sabaoth about 300 times in the Old Testament, and it literally means Yahweh of the hosts, or the Lord of the armies. And those armies were envisioned as these celestial battalions, these legions that were sort of mirroring Israel's actual physical soldiers. And so earlier cultures had said it's like a pantheon with all these different gods, because it's kind of hanging out. For Israel, it became a chain of command. And that turned into a theology of total loyalty. I mean, you remember the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That was not just abstract monotheism. That was like wartime propaganda. It means we have one commander. There's no divided loyalties. There's no negotiating with the neighboring gods for rain or fertility. And they eventually sort of codify this into their law and their philosophy. They say things like, you will utterly destroy them. Don't make any covenants with them. Show them no mercy. And that's not like a metaphor. These were identity commands, drills designed to forge this cohesion by excluding everybody else. Every generation would rehearse them out loud. Every festival, they'd have these recitations of divine victories. And every defeat, of course, was blamed on, oh, you didn't obey enough. That's why God let you be in trouble in that case. But this is a feedback loop that every authoritarian system relies on. If you have faith and you obey, you'll be protected. If you fail in some way, I will blame you for it. It's your fault. Either way, the loyalty deepens and deepens and deepens. Just a few examples of some of this. On Joshua 6 with Jericho, the Israelites, we know, marched around Jericho for 7 days. In the story, the priests blew the trumpets and the city collapses, and then they say every living thing is slaughtered for the Lord. The act is narrated. It's not a tragedy in the way they say it. This is obedience to God. They fulfilled their requirement to God. 1 Samuel 15 with Amalek, Saul is supposed to kill everybody. He's told, don't spare anybody. And he does the wrong thing. In their story, he spares some people, and Samuel gets very upset. And it says he comes out and he takes the king who's been left alive, Agag. He takes Agag, and who thinks he's now going to live and be okay. He hacks him to pieces in front of everybody, and he basically tells Saul, what the hell? I said kill everybody. And so mercy became a form of disobedience. Compassion was treason. Does that sound familiar at all? Empathy is a sin. Compassion is treason. Numbers 31 with Midian. Moses commands, you will kill every adult male and all the non-virgin women, and you can keep the virgins for yourself. That story is defining their sexual ethics as well as their ethnic cleansing in the same sentence, in the same breath. These ideas are monstrous to us, but in that context, that was their psychological function. They're turning genocide into theology and trauma into triumph. The people could face unbearable violence by reframing it as this is part of the divine plan, this is part of the divine necessity, both in terms of what God is going to do to us to purify us and what you have to do to the bad guys to destroy them. In that context, you get holiness. The holiness is so important. One second. Just checking here for any comments. Looks like we're good. You have the Hebrew word holy. It doesn't originally mean morally pure. It just means set apart. Kadosh. It means that the holiness is spatial and tribal. The people, the land, the temple, your dietary rules. They're going to keep us distinct from the contaminating outsiders. And so these purity codes, like we see in Leviticus, they reinforce these boundaries. It's the same logic as the war stories. If you stay separate, then you stay safe. And so what started maybe as sanitation, it becomes part of your salvation. You become clean versus unclean. This is the domesticated version of us versus them. And in that context, now you're bringing in, again, the psychology of chosenness. Chosenness is one of our most powerful coping mechanisms because it's transforming your insecurity into this grand story of your destiny. When your survival feels precarious, when your death feels imminent, suffering is probably going to happen, If you believe that the universe itself wants you to exist and to be safe and have a good outcome, that can provide an almost unbreakable morale. But obviously with that is a toxin that is horrific, which is extreme superiority. The moment that you define yourself as chosen, then others by definition are unchosen or not chosen, and they basically become either tools or threats or maybe a testing ground for you. Chosenness is converting your existential anxiety into a moral hierarchy. And Israel's prophets, we've read about that so many times when we were Christians. That was what they reinforced all the time. If you're wanting victory, just obey. There's a reason you got taken off to Babylon. There's a reason you got taken off to this place and that place. There's a reason you're not thriving. There's a reason you're not in the land of milk and honey, because you didn't obey. Defeat proves the sin. This is part of God's divine discipline. He wants to make your enemies show you the way back to him. And those weird dynamics are very weird to us now to think about, but they helped ensure this theological elasticity of how to explain everything. Every outcome could be interpreted as a way to preserve Yahweh's supremacy. If Israel prospered, Yahweh's clearly powerful. If Israel suffered, Yahweh's clearly just, and he's doing what he has to do to get you to be disciplined, to get back in the program. Either way, the faith survives. Again, we're just adding layers upon layers here for anyone joining us, layers upon layers. We're giving a context for the spiritual warfare that's we're talking about in current day. We will get there. But we're going to bring in next the idea of this propaganda in a sense of memory. By the time that eventually you have all these historians of the books of the Old Testament compiling the text, which is, obviously many centuries before Christ, but when they're starting to compile some of these texts, Israel had already, according to their stories, had already endured some exiles. And so writing history was part of arguably the therapy of how do you deal with this for people who are obviously very, very disillusioned. They began to mythologize the past to explain the present. We lost our land because we failed the covenant. We failed to obey. As they do that, and the people believe it, they are making their intellectual, psychological armor for their identity even stronger. And so things like the Torah and some of the prophets, they're not as much just saying, let me tell you what happened. This is the history. They're manuals for morale. They're telling you how to ritualize the memory so that we can sort of reignite our unity after the catastrophe, if the worst part of the catastrophe is over. The Bible's earliest books, in a sense, are their boot camp literature to say, come on, we got this. This has been horrible. We've been through a nightmare. Those of us that are left, pick yourself up. There's a bigger story here. We got this. We got to get through this. We got to move forward. Again, all these contexts, at that point, war becomes part of your worship. And you begin to see how violence and devotion to God and to your in-group, they begin to intertwine. Sacrifice becomes slaughter in a miniature sense. The altars mirror the battlefields. I will slit a lamb's throat. I will also slit my enemy's throat. Blood becomes everywhere, and it sort of sanctifies the soil. I'm going to slit a lamb's throat. It will sanctify me. I will slit my enemy's throats. I will sanctify the conquered land. In Psalm 18, it says, he trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. And we have other verses that talk about it's a blessed thing to dash your enemy's children's head against the rocks. This worship in that context isn't about being a pacifist. They're trying to militarize your soul. They're trying to militarize every part of your belief system. I mean, even the temple layout, you remember it was like a fortress. There were the outer courts, there's the inner sanctum, there are these guarded thresholds. Approaching God means going through layers of defense by purification and blood. That's the same thing as like the courts of a walled city. They're militarizing everything. Religion became organized vigilance to protect our land, our people. And again, there's these moral consequences that get hardwired into this. This worldview hardwired the idea that obedience is more important than empathy. The greatest virtue is submission to the divine order, not compassion for the victims. And they emphasize that purity is more important than anything else, and that purity eventually leads to power. If you are morally clean, that becomes your strength and proof of God's divine favor in you. If you're pure, you're powerful. God's on your side. Violence in that context, again, becomes a virtue. Killing can be holy if it's commanded by God. God says slaughter the Amalekites. If he says it, then it must be right, right? According to them. And then suffering becomes significant. When you get defeated, it doesn't falsify your belief system. It just confirms that you're being tested. And those kinds of principles echo through Christianity, through Judaism, through Islam, through other forms of colonialism, and even through modern politics. I mean, I think arguably MAGA and Trumpism is this stuff just evolved to current day with technology, but it's the same story. It's the same atrocities. It's the same mess. They explain why people who believe this stuff can commit cruelty with a very clear conscience. They inherited a moral logic where cruelty is a form of obedience and empathy is weakness. Because when you go from all these bad things to we got to be part of the story and make a difference. How do you make a difference? You obey. Well, what is obedience? Us versus them. This is a war. This is a war. And again, we're going to move towards spiritual warfare in current day with Pentecostal kind of stuff. We're going to move toward it, but you have to get a big context to feel how did we get here? By the end of the Babylonian exile, Yahweh was no longer just, again, one tribal God among many. He was the only God. The entire universe was part of his battlefield. And so the local wars of Canaan had been scaled up to a metaphysical drama. And of course, they were inheriting a lot of things from Zoroastrianism that made that story evolve, but still it evolved. And the theology goes through all these stages that would universalize this fear. Evil was no longer just the Philistines or the Amalekites or whatever, or the Egyptians. The evil is the entire unseen world, eventually, of demons and cosmic powers. And the tribal God of armies, Yahweh, becomes the commander of all of creation. And once the battlefield moves from Israel and Canaan and Egypt right there in Syria and Babylon and Greece, once the battlefield moves from there into the metaphysical world, humanity itself becomes this huge battlefield, this huge terrain of war. And that's how the early Jewish apocalyptic imagination turned their national trauma into the early versions of what we would now call spiritual warfare. When Israel returned from the Babylonian exile, and that was around the 6th century BCE, something happened. Their wars were lost, their temple was burned, their monarchy was gone, and these people had their whole identity forged in the idea of victory. But they'd been massively defeated over and over and over in horrific ways, and their defeat demanded a new theology. If Yahweh was really supreme, how in the world could his chosen people have been so viciously conquered for so long? And the answer required a new kind of enemy, one that you couldn't see or defeat by a physical enemy. And the war moved from land to heaven. The battlefield basically became invisible. While they were exiled in Babylon and then later under Persian rule, the scribes encountered, again, Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's first truly dualistic religions. They described creation as this cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and deceit. And humanity's moral choices would tip the balance between the two. And for this very traumatized community in exile, this worldview of Zoroastrianism was very intoxicating, I think we could argue. Excuse me. It was basically preserving the idea of divine perfection. Yahweh is all powerful and good, just like their God, or Mazda. Our Yahweh is all powerful and all good, but it sort of takes this cause of evil and puts it on something. It relocates it to this independent, malevolent intelligence, this other army out there somewhere. And instead of admitting that violence and cruelty was part of their national story, Israel could just say, we were attacked by cosmic forces. That's what's been going on here. We weren't just attacked by this nation or that nation. We were attacked by cosmic forces. And when you see some of the books and the prophets, you begin to see this influence start to echo, very quiet at first, but it echoes through it. passages that used to speak of Yahweh's control over everything start to introduce figures of rebellion, such as in Isaiah 14, the morning star has fallen from heaven. All of a sudden, we're bringing in astrotheology. And I don't mean some of the ways that we use it, in our discussions on my channel a lot, but just this idea that what we're seeing on earth as it is on earth, or as it is on earth, so it is in heaven, or vice versa. We're seeing the things going on above us. You can literally, like, to their minds, you could study the stars and figure out some of the history of the universe. And, that was originally a taunt. That verse was a taunt at the Babylonian king, but later interpreters did personify it as Satan. And so we get these seeds, these early seeds of this cosmic adversary. And then in the early Hebrew text, Satan or Hasatan, it just means he's an accuser, sort of a divine prosecutor. It appears in Job and Zechariah, but he sort of works for Yahweh. He's testing human loyalty. But across the centuries of suffering, his character mutates. And by the intertestamental period, Satan becomes the enemy. He's this rival power leading fallen angels and corrupting the nations. And that shift happened for a very specific reason, because there's people who could not fight empire after empire after empire. They were basically just completely losing everywhere they looked. They had to believe that they had a chance to win, and they had to believe that they were at war. If they could turn their trauma into cosmology, basically, and into astrotheology, they could restore their dignity. So all these defeats in their history, they became battles in a larger invisible campaign. That was their theological alchemy, taking powerlessness and sort of transforming it into a divine strategy. And that's where you start to see the apocalyptic literature, which became the early blueprint of our current spiritual warfare discussions. Between like 300 BCE and 100 CE, the Jewish writers produced a massive flood of apocalyptic works. Daniel, Enoch, the War Scrolls of Qumran, and they present the same pattern. The world is under a temporary power, a temporary authority that's evil. There is a chosen remnant that remains faithful amid the corruption. God will come soon and intervene, and it will be violent. It'll be cosmic violence. And then history will end in a final judgment. The righteous will be vindicated, the wicked will be annihilated. And everyone that's the remnant, the chosen ones, will rejoice at what God has done. That is the birth of sort of, again, linear time as the battle narrative. There's no longer these cycles of rise and fall. This is a single, irreversible campaign toward ultimate victory. It's sort of the mental architecture. It's the mental architecture of Christianity that we all inherited, that basically remains pretty darn intact to this day. The book of Daniel that was written during the persecution of Antiochus, he turns the political propaganda into this apocalyptic vision where the beast is like the empires. Remember that? All these pictures of the beast and the shoes and all that. The angels are fighting in heaven. Michael, the archangel, becomes Israel's celestial general. And you hear in certain passages about the prince of Persia detaining a divine messenger for like 21 days. There's this diplomatic standoff in heaven between these cosmic bureaucrats that mirror our international politics. It's like a geopolitical theology in a mythic form. And you bring in, again, the Essenes at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all that group. There are these separatist sects waiting for God's war. And they copy these texts that are literally titled things like the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. I don't know if you've ever read that, but again, the title, The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness. And they literally, in the desert, practiced their military drills. They wore symbolic armor, and they believed that their purity rituals were helping them to participate in this cosmic war, this cosmic front. For them, holiness and the battle were indistinguishable. And that's sort of, the early evidence of what later Christians would call spiritual warfare. This conviction that moral purity, ritual obedience, and physical discipline all contribute to a very real cosmic fight that you better get involved in. You better not act like just because you can't see it's not there. It's real. It's all syncretism. It's all evolution, but it's very real, and it's dominating our world today. We're not out of it by any stretch. We're still absolutely steeped in this stuff. The dualism that we're talking about basically, again, simplified the trauma. It offered a very elegant solution, a very elegant emotional solution to this. If good and evil are distinct substances, suffering does not implicate God being good. So instead of you having to confront the moral ambiguity and the issue of, why is there evil in this world, your side, you're thinking, maybe my side is cruel, maybe my hands are bloody. Instead, you can always externalize the guilt onto the realm that you might call the demonic, the other side, the bad guys. Psychologically, it protects believers from cognitive dissonance. And socially, it's going to create this perpetual mobilization. There can never be peace, because peace would mean facing the complexity of it all. And complexity, again, feels like doubt. But in a dualistic system, mercy looks suspicious, and ambiguity looks sinful, and compromise looks like treason. And that's how their theology became very self-defending. It forbids the very mental flexibility that could dissolve it. Apocalyptic Judaism developed a very elaborate hierarchy of this stuff, of angels and demons, of armies, again, mirroring human armies and institutions. You see Gabriel delivering messages. You see Michael commanding troops. You see fallen angels ruling nations. You see the heavens starting to look like an empire in the sky. And that's what we might call mirroring the social order. People imagine that the divine realm is shaping our politics, what's happening up above, as above, so below. Babylon and Persia ruled through their multi-tiered administrations. So did heaven. Kings maintain order through violence. So does the cosmic king. Theocracy, in a sense, was projected upward and then reflected and bounced right back down. And by the time of books like the Book of Wisdom and other pseudographia, every moral question that you have could be read as a little micro battle between angels and demons for your soul's allegiance. Human agency is still there, but it operates inside this vast spiritual war economy. And again, sin is treason, obedience is enlistment. You're on the right side. And that's where they take this early seeds of the afterlife too, and that becomes part of the battleground as well. The early Hebrews, they had very little concept of heaven or hell. People say, oh, there's no heaven or hell. That's not exactly true. There was, but it was early. It was unevolved in a sense. Sheol was a shadowy underworld, a cave where all the dead people went. But they did have some other parts of it that we would associate with heaven and hell. But when you get to the Persian and Hellenistic influences, the moral geography of the afterlife becomes much more crystallized. Every soul's fate gets reflected by its role in the war. If you're righteous here and you're part of the battle here, you're doing the right things and obeying Yahweh here, then you'll be going upwards to paradise. The elevator's going up for you. If you're wicked and you're disobedient, your elevator trip is going down to punishment, to the bad place. And again, Zoroastrianism helped to sort of move them from the generic Sheol to a much more concrete heaven-hell perspective. But your human existence, your lifespan, basically becomes at that point your testing ground, your boot camp for eternity. What you do in your life is where you make the decision, am I going left or right? This is your watershed moment. Your life is your watershed moment, and you're going to pay for it forever. That shift was so radical because it moralized, in a sense, time itself. Every moment becomes a test of your loyalty. Evil was no longer like an occasional failure. You're either on the right side and you're serving them, or you're not. And so this goes from cosmic to very personal. Once evil becomes universalized, it becomes internalized next. And if the devil can inhabit all these nations and these kings, he can also inhabit your mind and your heart. If angels can guide whole empires, they can also whisper in your individual thoughts, hey, I think you should do this bad thing. And the battlefield moves from the sky to your brain, to your psyche. When you look at books like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs and other of the late Jewish writings that portray temptation, they talk about it as literally demonic influence. Your human conscience becomes a very contested territory. Angels and demons are fighting for you, fighting for your attention. They're fighting for your loyalty. And that's the soil in which Paul's theology eventually grows. The flesh versus the spirit, the old man versus the new. And when as they redefine the human struggle as spiritual warfare, those texts make a basically a perpetual anxiety of like, who's influencing me? Who am I listening to? That becomes your form of religion, your form of piety. Your fear of being on the wrong side becomes proof that you're faithful. By the 1st century CE, those layers had fused. Judaism had completely evolved from a tribal, eventually, first it was a lot of gods, but eventually becomes a tribal monolatry, and eventually into a moralized dualism. And Christianity just absorbs the whole damn system, the entire structure, and eventually with Constantine, it universalizes it. The tribal god of armies becomes the cosmic Christ of the universe, and everybody's a soldier on one side or the other. So when the Hebrew prophets spoke of things like swords being beaten into plowshares, some of them were dreaming of ending that pattern, but by the time of Jesus, the dream inverts. Peace itself was sort of interpreted as a strategic delay. The war story consumed everything: ethics, politics, psychology, your imagination. And it was a very war-hunted, demon-hunted world. And this small apocalyptic movement proclaiming there that the kingdom of God was near. We're almost to the end. The big battle is almost here. We're on the doorstep. John and Jesus both saying the kingdom of God is at hand. And in that story, what happens right then and there, it fuses, somewhat of a version of compassion, but compassion and conquest in a way that we have never escaped from. And this is where the message of Jesus, which was filtered through persecution and through empire, through wars, through all these bad things that were going on at that time, it became spiritual warfare theology that still, again, shapes us today. When Jesus appeared, or whether he was real or not, I don't know, but when he or his story appeared in 1st century Judea, the air was thick with revolution. There were Romans occupying them, pressing down everybody. There were zealot movements whispering of, hey, we're going to revolt. We're going to do something really crazy cool here. We're going to take over. Prophets were wandering around saying, God's kingdom's about to break out. It's just hold on and be faithful. You got weeks, maybe months, but it's almost here. If you're a JW, you know what that sounds like. It's almost here. You're probably not going to have to worry about anything much more than a few months, maybe a year or two max, but we're right there. The signs are all over. We're here. And when you have people believing that God's about to break through history with his sword, you can understand how Christianity, as it absorbs this logic of war, you can see how Jesus was not preaching peace in a vacuum. He was doing something else. He was doing something very specific. He was preaching in a world that had already seen peace as victory, and victory as proof of God's favor. But they needed to figure out when is this peace that's supposedly here going to turn from Romans' peace into our peace as the good guys. And so the Gospels describe Jesus as saying, again, the kingdom of God is right here. It's at hand. It's almost here. And that was to them revolutionary language. It meant that Rome's domination, political, military, spiritual, it was all about to end. The prophets promised that Yahweh was going to act very decisively, very quickly. He was going to overthrow the nations. He was going to restore Israel's freedom, and the people that were pure and obedient today and waiting for that of Yahweh's arrival and the angels' arrival, they would be fighting alongside these angels, and they would be victorious and they would be honored for their faithfulness. And Jesus's message wasn't abstract morality. It was the announcement of a very imminently coming regime change. This was sort of the divine, coup de grace. His miracles were even framed as combat. I'm casting out demons. This was a campaign against Satan's occupation. Healing the sick. It's like reclaiming territory from corruption. Every act of compassion was sort of an act of war. The battlefield had shifted inward, but the strategy was still the same. We're going to conquer evil to bring about God's reign. Remember in Luke 10, Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's obviously very heavy with apocalyptic significance, but it helps us understand that his ministry, his story was in a context of this cosmic war that was already underway. It was a rebellion being crushed in real time. Jesus wasn't just a prophet resisting the empire. He was portrayed as the general of heaven's counteroffensive. And even when he spoke of loving enemies or turning the other cheek, His words were framed as like a paradoxical strategy. You win the war by refusing to fight it conventionally. He told his followers, take up the cross, which to a first century Jew meant prepare to die under Roman execution as a loyal soldier of God's cause. The cross was not yet a symbol of forgiveness. It was a symbol of loyalty unto death. Spiritual warfare waged through surrender. And so when you look at this, you're seeing how the story evolves from crucifixion to a cosmic victory. After Jesus was executed, or at least how the story went, his followers were in this theological crisis. Messiahs weren't supposed to die. They were supposed to win. But the movement refused to die with him. Again, they're trying so much for centuries to reinterpret defeat as triumph. That's what this whole thing is about. They just keep on trying and trying and trying to reinterpret it. Where is the big reversal? And if they could do that, then they could figure out a way to survive this and think that they're still part of the big story. And that's what they did. They said, by dying, he defeated the biggest enemy out there. The biggest enemy is not Satan. The biggest enemy is actually death. And so in that revolutionary move, for the first time in religious history, a completely, utterly failed revolution became to them proof of victory. Suffering, humiliation, even martyrdom became their weapons. Christianity turned victimhood into a strategy. And the cross became sort of both a sword and a shield. Its message was that the battle's already won. You just have to be faithful. And that message, though, came with a very psychological cost. Every hardship was now going to be read as part of this cosmic ongoing war. Pain was never just pain. It was warfare. It was very personal. And then you get into Paul. Paul comes along. And no one arguably solidified this idea better than Paul did. He was a Roman citizen, but he was a Jew. He's a trained Pharisee. He was a survivor of persecution, even though he as well persecuted other Christians. But he had this ability to take this apocalyptic Judaism and turn it into a much bigger ideology that it transcended Hebrew people. It was for Gentiles too now. He took the battlefield out of Palestine and he sort of planted it in our minds. In Ephesians 6, you remember he talks about the whole armor of God. Stand against the wiles of the devil. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Passages like that became the blueprint for Christian militarism for 2,000 years now. But arguably to Paul's first readers, it was not just a metaphor. Principalities and powers refers to demonic forces and to Roman authorities. Every empire became an outpost of the devil, and every act of faith was sort of your counterinsurgency. Paul describes believers as athletes and soldiers and runners and fighters. He likes these metaphors of struggle and endurance because when he's given these letters, faith is not just serenity, it's resistance. He's taking their apocalyptic dualism of the whole age and he internalizes it so thoroughly that every thought becomes a potential treason or loyalty. He says in 2 Corinthians 10, take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Total warfare, psychological, moral, emotional. The believer becomes the battlefield, and the armor of God becomes your strategy. You think about where he says like the belt of truth, that was a soldier's badge of identity. The breastplate of righteousness was protection for your vital organs. The shield of faith was the defense against the fiery darts, literal and spiritual. The helmet of salvation, signifying you belong to a victorious army. And the sword of the Spirit, the weapon of your divine speech. He's militarizing spirituality by transforming discipleship into discipline. And faith was no longer belief alone. It was vigilance, training, readiness. The Christian life became a boot camp for eternity. And because Paul also preached the days are evil, the war is basically imminent. There's no rest. There's no demobilization. He says to people, if you're not married, don't get married. He's expecting this thing to end anytime now. He's just sitting on the edge of his seat, just like Jesus and the disciples would have done. Paul's on the edge of his seat. Where is it today? Okay, well, it's probably tomorrow then. And for the first 3 centuries, that was kind of the context in which all this was sort of percolating. Obviously, there were some big upsets there with the destruction of the temple, and a lot of these people just basically died away, thinking that it was going to be any moment now, and it wasn't. But this small group of people that were so marginalized and persecuted, facing hostility from both the Romans as well as even Jewish authorities, instead of it breaking their faith, Their persecution validated it. If you're suffering, it proves you authentic. The world hates you, you must be on God's side. Every imprisonment, every execution, every martyrdom was propaganda for divine victory. And you probably heard this quote from Tertullian, if I can say his name right, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That was their strategy. The more they bled, the more the story spread. Pain became evangelism. And then it shifted from peace to more of a mobilization. The Christian communities developed hierarchies to manage the chaos of the growth. After Constantine, everybody's a Christian now. The apostles essentially became commanders. Bishops became officers. Deacons became sort of the people that did the logistics. The language of military obedience entered church life. Discipline, order, subordination. And by the 2nd century CE, the term ecclesia came out, the term ecclesia militans, which means the church militant. It appeared to describe believers still fighting on the earth. We're the church militant. Eventually we will die and join the church triumphant in heaven. The metaphysics of salvation became their campaign plan. And the psychological consequence of what this world did back then and still does is it fused your identity with what do you oppose and what do you hate. To be a Christian is to be at war, not just with temptation or society, but with unseen powers that never rest. If you doubt, you have been infiltrated. If there's any failure, the enemy has sabotaged you. There is no moral neutral ground. This creates in people, it created it in back then, it creates it in us now, a sense of hypervigilance. We're constantly scanning for the threats because we are at war. And in their spiritual dynamics, that felt holy. I'm at war. Yeah, you better believe I'm at war, and I'm a fighter, and I'm going to make a difference. I will obey God. I will absolutely be on the right side of history. In more neurological contexts, this is very much just a way of exhausting yourself to the point of drowning in just the overwhelm of it all. You can dress it up as some kind of devotion to God, but you're exhausting yourself every minute of the day. You are constantly looking for what is trying to attack me, what is trying to make me not be a soldier in the Lord's army. And your adrenaline becomes part of the metaphorical liturgy. Every sermon, every prayer, every testimony, it recharges you. This cycle of vigilance. I must be vigilant. I must be aware. Where are the demons? Where is the sin? And that's how religion colonizes your nervous system and mine. You and I live perpetually in a moral emergency. You never have a chance to exhale. This is just you just like you going way back. You are the primate that's looking around. Is that rustle in the leaves? Is that just the wind and the grass? Or is that a tiger that's going to eat me? That same emergency of like, oh my goodness, everything is at stake and what I do next. They just made that part of their theology. Christianity's central contradiction sort of pops out of this specific part of it. It preaches peace, but it sort of requires an eternal enemy to survive. It claims the war is already won, but it commands its followers to keep fighting. It says there was a curse in the Garden of Eden, and Jesus reversed the curse. But the war's not over. If it claims again the war's already won, but your commanders are telling you got to keep fighting it. It says we're the faith of love, but we're going to organize as an army. And so even the symbol of ultimate surrender, the cross, becomes an emblem that people wear on crusade banners. The Crusaders, they had crosses all over. It became a banner of, this is our fight. This is what we put on our shields. And you get into a sort of a psychological double bind. You are told as a believer to rest in the victory while still training for a perpetual battle that's basically never going to end. And you have it in your mind like, someday we'll get to Gog and Magog. Someday we'll get to Armageddon. Someday we'll get to the end. It's always way out there. And the longer that human history goes, it's way out there. Christians live between this, in this world of this in between of relief and readiness. I've got the joy, but I'm a soldier in the Lord's army of joy and dread. And this tension that's unresolved and unresolvable is what allows spiritual warfare to just pass on and migrate from generation to generation. It is terrifying, and to them it's meaningful, and it is addictive, very addictive. Again, by the time that Christianity emerges from persecution into like a political power, the template's complete. War is spiritualized, victory is redefined, obedience is weaponized, and all that remained at that time was for the empire to take notice, and it did. When Constantine raised the cross above his armies, he wasn't inventing Christian militarism, he was inheriting it. He inherited a theology that had already trained millions by that time to think of faith as a battle. That's the context in which the metaphor becomes literal. The church that once preached endurance learns to wield the sword, and the invisible war finds a physical empire. A physical empire. By the 4th century, everything changed. This movement of small house gatherings, refugees, slaves, people with no power, people wandering, praying for God's deliverance, it suddenly becomes the religion of the emperor himself. And with that one alliance, the entire grammar of faith gets rewritten. Before Constantine, Christianity survives through endurance. After Constantine, it survives through control. The invisible war finally puts on its physical armor, and it gets down to the dirty work. And when the emperor converted, when Constantine converted, politics and prophecy sort of merged, didn't they? You remember it was, I believe it was 312 CE, and there was one of the battles there where Constantine claims that he saw a vision in the sky. He claims he saw a cross of light, and in the words, "By this sign you will conquer." And who knows if some of that's made up, but from what we inherited of that story, that's what was supposedly happened. And he supposedly orders his troops to paint the Christian symbols on their shields. They win the battle, and he legalizes Christianity through the Edict of Milan. And what we can debate the sincerity of his faith. I think there's a lot of reasons to think it was more just a political move, but the sincerity almost doesn't matter. What mattered was the symbolism. The empire that had crucified Christ now marched under his name. This theology that was born in the crucible of persecution becomes the ideology of power, and the militarization was immediate. The churches would receive funding, imperial funding. The bishops got legal authority, and the cross again became this banner of victory. It was the perfect fusion of religion and state. Moral absolutism married to this imperial Roman might. And by a few years later, when Constantine began to convene these councils, getting all these bishops from across the whole empire to settle the disputes, mostly about whether Christ was fully divine or not, the emperor was basically dictating the terms of the theology. And the creeds that they produced were not just statements of belief, they were the boundary lines of loyalty. They were part of this spiritual warfare that was now physical. And if you would confess the creeds, you were swearing allegiance to Christ and to Constantine, to dissent was treason against both the physical empire as well as against heaven. And from that point forward, doctrinal debate became treated like mutiny, and the language of heresy evolved. At that point, it became like a legal category. If you chose wrongly, you were rebelling against God and the state. The faith at that point acquired police power. And just one generation later, you get Augustine, who would cement that theology with his concept of the just war. He said he had a book called The City of God. And in his book, City of God, he which was written after Rome was sacked, Augustine said wars could be righteous if they're waged to preserve peace and to punish evil. In other words, violence could be a form of love as long as it served divine justice. He said things like peace is the purpose of waging war, so that people can live without injustice. And they sort of did this moral inversion where killing could now be part of the obedience. Coercion could be charity. And the war metaphor that Paul had as again, more of a metaphor, it finally became their actual physical moral philosophy. And from those seeds of Augustine grew the Crusades, the Inquisition, and all of these colonial missions, every one of them claiming to bring salvation through domination. The church became the empire. You got, again, the hierarchy. You got the architecture, you got the liturgy, you got the language, you have theologians talking all the time at that time of triumph and victory and dominion and kingdom. It was much more about the kingdom than about compassion at all. Faith became something you administer, and your devotion to Christ became your duty to the state. And so arguably, if Jesus had seen it, I think he would have, if he was real, he would have said, this isn't what I asked for. But his gospel of obedience to the Torah and his gospel of love, it just got absorbed into this machine of Rome. And believers, though, were thinking of themselves as in a battle. And that's where this rhetoric of spiritual warfare persisted, and it redirected against both the people that didn't believe, obviously, but it also was against internal enemies within the state of saying, if you're a heretic, if you're a pagan, if you're a dissenter, if you're an apostate, then you're part of this cosmic battle. The war isn't ending, it's just changing targets. You have a war on heresy. And by the way, I'm going to probably wrap this up in about 5 more minutes, just for the sake of my voice, and then we'll meet up again either later tonight or tomorrow and pick it up. But when you get to the 4th century, you have emperors where Christianity gets officially declared like this is the one and only religion of the Roman Empire. And they just completely outlawed all the pagan worship. They destroyed the temples. They burned the libraries, which is so sad. And people who would not get baptized as Christians would be exiled or killed or something like that. And so the persecuted people became the persecuting empire. And the councils that evolved from that, instead of saying we're against violence and we're against this army or that army, they again became focused on being against ideas. We're against the Gnostics, we're against the Arians, we're against the Pelagians, we're against the Donatists. Everyone is like a threat to the divine order. And to disagree with the main bishops and eventually the Pope was to conspire with Satan. The battlefield moved from land to heaven, down to politics, down to your thought life. And so you basically get the real soldiers at this point become the monks and the martyrs, right? In this new imperial Christianity, martyrdom could no longer just mean dying for the faith. It's like you have this context where monks and hermits become these spiritual athletes. They're battling demons in the desert. They're fasting. They're going through sleeplessness. They're doing self-denial. It gets described in the military language of like these are campaigns and fortresses and sieges. There's a guy named Athanasius you may have heard of. He wrote a book called Life of Antony, where he turns his private suffering into public warfare. In this book, and it inspired many generations to see discipline, like the physical discipline against your body. If you can say, my body is full of lust and my body is full of bad ideas and bad things that just want to totally obey the devil and totally dishonor God. Your body is now the battlefield. And so it switches. So your monastery cell becomes your new foxhole in this battle. So even when you're in solitude, the war is continuing. Spiritual warfare just keeps going. You get again to the Crusaders. We talked about them a minute ago, but they became the seeds of a lot of the violence that we see today. The official Crusades didn't begin until a little bit later from that time that I just mentioned, but the imagination was forming. The people talking all the time about war and fighting and the spiritual warfare. And then when you get the Roman Empire that splits, the East and the West, they both carry the same sort of idea, the same DNA. Victory proves virtue. If we have a conquest of some sort, if we expand the kingdom, then we're doing God's will. Conversion is going to justify any kind of force and coercion that we bring up. Missionaries get sent to pagan tribes, and you get a context of the sword and the gospel marching together. And, to be outside of the church meant to be either on the wrong side of the cosmic war, or at least to be unarmed in the cosmic war. And so our language begins to really get militarized. You get words like the army of Christ, and you get phrases like baptism as enlistment that starts to come into the sermons and letters of those days. Children get catechized in the church, and they're told they're recruits in the Lord's army. When you believe, you're being conscripted. And they're weaving into it the whole time, this psychology and verbiage of domination, this authoritarian system. We're going to give you this moral certainty, this safety, in exchange for your obedience. And our fears used to hold us together as a persecuted community, but now our power holds us together. We will maintain control by power. This hierarchy that's preached obedience is now basically mirroring our obedience to God. If you obey God, then obey your warriors here. And again, if you disagree with us, then you are part of the demonic rebellion. If you question your pastor, your bishop's word, you're basically risking your soul. And that suited the empire very well, because they taught citizens before to submit to Caesar. Now they're teaching believers to submit to the church. Different hierarchies, one theology. Both of them claiming this is God doing this. We have a divine right to be an authority here. And so when you look at the way that they were originally, again, persecuted to now they're in charge, this is their new policy, they begin to weaponize morality. By the 5th century, spiritual warfare was completely institutionalized. Sermons all over the place, warning of invisible demons. But the real threat was disobedience to your authority. Exorcisms began to really expand at that time. They're not just covering your personal sins. Oh, you have a demon of doubt, whatever. They would exorcise demons of political dissent. And your moral purity became a state function. When Augustine had been writing about the city of God and the city of man, he wasn't separating heaven and earth. He was providing people with a manual for managing both. The church would govern souls, the empire would govern bodies, and together they would wage war against the chaos. And that began a very long partnership that still exists to this day between theology and totalitarianism. And we see it in the current U.S. administration. It's not over yet. We have inherited Augustine. We have inherited Constantine. Spiritual warfare 101. And this is where we are now. I have a lot more I want to go over, but number one, my voice is it's at a good spot. I'm hanging on there, but I don't want to push it too far and end up starting to cough too much at you. We will pick this up, but I do hope that this kind of stuff helps you to start to see spiritual warfare and this idea of you're in the Lord's army in a bigger picture. Again, it's not that we couldn't just blurt it out in a 15-minute poem and say this is really toxic, this stuff. It is toxic. It's incredibly toxic. And if we take a short version of it, which we do on some topics, sometimes it just helps to say, yeah, that's bullshit. And I'm done with that. That stuff has nothing to do with reality. It's irrelevant. It's mythology. But sometimes I think it's worth it to go back to some of these things and to try to put these layers in and unpack it, look at where the roots, how they grew, and to say, okay, I can see better how we got here. And therefore I can see more clearly why it is so stinking hard for our culture to get out of this. It doesn't excuse it. And it does, in some ways, it makes it almost more sad, because like, wow, this really isn't like some new thing that the charismatics or the Pentecostals came up with. Like this is like from the earliest days. This is early stuff. We're talking about Zoroastrianism. We're talking about hundreds of years BC, if not longer, arguably. And you could, again, go back to 100,000 years BC, really. If you want to, you could really go back further and say, this is where this stuff came from. This came from animism. This came from tribalism. And it just kept evolving into the tribal wars, the local stuff there in Canaan and other parts of the world too. But it isn't, we focus here on Judaism and Christianity, but other religions did it too. But when you look at this, you can say, holy smokes, this is like in our DNA. And it hurts, because you think, are we going to get rid of religion anytime soon? I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news if it's not already obvious, but probably not. This stuff's been around for so long, it's probably just going to keep on evolving. It might not, Christianity might not have the center reigns in 100 years or 200 years, but it'll be something else. It'll be something else. We are the kind of people, we are the kind of species that take our fears, and we don't feel good unless we have answers, even if they're fake answers. They're made up answers, mythology answers. And if we have those fake answers and they make us feel secure, like we can live our lives and feel like we're part of some bigger story, We let a lot of the cognitive dissonance go because we feel safe. And life in many ways is about one big question: am I safe? Am I safe or not? And as long as I'm relatively safe, I'll be part of this system. It could be the most toxic system in the world. But as long as I'm relatively safe, I'll support it. I'll at least go along with it. And that's what we've been doing. We've never gotten out of that hamster wheel. We think that the unexamined life is worth living as long as we're safe. And I would argue that that is not remotely true. The unexamined life, the unexamined worldview is not worth living. But you can see why our loved ones are so addicted to war, both metaphorical and unfortunately to very literal war. You can see why you have Jewish people being very willing to do horrific things to Gazans, and as well as Muslims being willing to do horrific things to Jewish people and to us in America. Like there's just everybody's doing it to everybody. Everybody says I'm justified by my extreme violence, and at some point, you got to give yourself a chance to step back from that and say, imagine no religion. I mean, go back to John Lennon, for goodness sake. Imagine no religion. I wonder if you can. We can keep dreaming, but I hope some of this stuff does help us to think through where we're at now and how we can approach those who are still so addicted to it. But thank you again so much for your support. I'm just going to see if there's any quick comments that I need to read real quick before I go. See here, religion colonize your nervous system. Yeah. Let's see here. There's a whole bunch of comments, but I think some of them were from a while ago, so I'm just going to keep moving. Rome still controls 1/8 of the people of the world. Yeah, they're pretty successful, I'd say. Agreed. Thank you so much, Susanna, for your super chat. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate it a lot. Why can't people believe in God without having to bow to the Bible's Rome system? Just my thoughts. Yeah. Really hope I get my son to watch this. Thank you so much. So much lost forever because they burn the libraries. Yeah. Imagine what stuff is out there that we could have seen. And imagine what stuff's underneath the Vatican that it's still there and it's doing just fine. We just can't see it. Oh, exactly. Okay. So you said the exact same thing. Took the words out of my mouth. Thank you for putting it in such a clear way on YouTube for the world to see. Thank you, John. I appreciate your support. People shouldn't believe in the Bible as God, and calling it the word of God is scary. Yeah. Yeah. Same for the Quran. Quran is just, it's just evolution. You know, Christianity evolved Judaism, Islam evolved Judaism and Christianity. It's more syncretism. There was a section in the Bible that said, Jesus said, you make them twice the spawns of hell as you are to the religious leaders, and sending them all over the world. And I think it's still happening today. Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephen. Appreciate your support. Yeah. Demon Jesus. Thank you for the knowledge. Thank you so much, Danny. Yeah. Let's give peace a chance. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, unfortunately, but we're going to dream. We're going to dream. There are others who will dream with us. I would love a world without it. I get sad I was born in a time when it exists. Yeah. I mean, imagine what it will be like without it. But I do think that, unfortunately, even if Christianity dies down and Islam dies down, if Judaism dies down, something else I think will replace it. I think it's religion and our need for answers in a very scary world, and the reality of death and suffering. There's just something about us that says we are so terrorized by not having answers that we have to make up fake answers just to get through it all. I don't think that's the right way to live, but that's the way our world works. I believe you have a good heart, Tim, and mean well helping people see and look deeper. Thank you so much. Definitely trying to understand, and also trying to find ways to talk to those we love who are still stuck in this mythology. Well, thank you all so much. One more. Too bad the writings are inspiring to make the end battle happen, not the other way around. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you all so much. Again, my apologies for my voice. Thank you for bearing with me. You all are the best. And I will, again, I may jump into a live stream later today. My voice is right on the edge, so it probably will be more like tomorrow. But it's okay. I've got lots of interviews that I've done to edit and publish. So I'll just work on those. Hopefully get something done here that'll come out and be published soon. But I appreciate you all so much. Thanks for being a part of my life and my community. Have a great night.